Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking with author and pilot examiner John Ewing about the technology and performance of the Diamond DA42 twin-engine aircraft, as well as tips for flying these aircraft and for passing a multi-engine check ride. We'll also hear from Savvy Aviation's Mike Bush about the Continental Service Bulletin that came out this week. And so that you don't miss next week's episode in whatever app you're listening to now, take a moment, just reach out there, find that subscribe or the follow key, touch it now, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 262, we talked with Tom Turner about a study that suggests that partial engine failures are more dangerous than total engine failures. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/262. And this is a listener-supported show. You're a listener, so hopefully you are supporting the show in some way. So if you enjoy Aviation News Talk and you're getting some value from it, which I'm guessing you are because you're listening right now, please go ahead and take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to sign up to become a member and join the club and support Aviation News Talk. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. This week in the news, Continental issues a service bulletin affecting 6-cylinder engines. A pilot accidentally activates a parachute, and a survey of dream jobs is out, and we'll tell you where being a pilot falls on the list. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, Continental issues Counterweight inspection bulletin. Continental Aerospace Technologies just released a mandatory service bulletin describing how to inspect for improperly installed snap rings on about 2,000 6-cylinder engines. The bulletin describes how to reseat the rings if necessary and also details warranty reimbursement. The issue surfaced earlier this month when Continental notified Cirrus through a letter that snap rings had been improperly installed on engines and crankshafts manufactured between June 21st, 2021 and February 7th, 2023. Continental said Monday that the problem was caused by improper assembly, not a defective part. Engines affected are Continental 360, 470, 520, and 550 series engines and replacement crankshaft assemblies. And after the news, we'll hear from Mike Bush as he answers a listener question about this service bulletin. And we have a pair of airline stories for which we know the what but not the why. And here's the first one from theaircurrent.com, which was the first outlet to break this story. United airliner dives after Maui departure is added to the list of industry close calls. A United Airlines Boeing 777 came within about 800 feet of impacting the Pacific Ocean off the north coast of Maui shortly after takeoff on December 18th. The occurrence, not previously reported, adds to a series of extremely serious safety incidents and major operational disruptions within the U.S. aviation system in recent weeks. Flight 1722 from Maui to San Francisco left Kaului Airport at 2:49 p.m. Hawaiian time in stormy weather. It initially appeared to climb normally. Data analyzed with Flight Radar 24 showed the aircraft reached roughly 2,200 feet before beginning a steep dive that, according to the telemetry, reached a descent rate of nearly 8,600 feet per minute. The aircraft quickly recovered, but not before descending below 775 feet. 2 people familiar with the incident said the climb produced forces of nearly 2.7 times the force of gravity on the aircraft and its occupants, as that steep descent transitioned to an 8,600 foot per minute climb. The entire incident appears to have stretched no more than 45 seconds and occurred between radio calls with air traffic controllers in Maui. The aircraft subsequently climbed to 3,300 feet and landed in California 27 minutes early, after the 4-hour and 15-minute Pacific crossing. The Boeing wide-body, configured with 364 seats, was quickly turned around at SFO and departed Chicago on its next flight about 2.5 hours later. Weather information available at the time of departure showed heavy rain at the time of takeoff, and the clouds were broken at 900 feet and overcast at 2,000 feet. And from avweb.com, our second story, NTSB subpoenas JFK Runway Incursion crew after they refused recorded interviews. The NTSB has taken the rare step of issuing subpoenas to the crew of an American Airlines Boeing 777 involved in a runway incursion at JFK in mid-January. The crew provided written statements, but has refused to be interviewed by investigators because their statements would be recorded for later transcription. Controllers agreed to the recorded interviews. The Allied Pilots Association, which represents the pilots, is backing the crew's decision, saying the new recording requirement is a relatively new wrinkle in the investigation process. The NTSB says the recording is necessary to ensure the complete accuracy of the crew's statements. Quote, as a result of the flight crew's repeated unwillingness to proceed with a recorded interview, subpoenas for their testimony have been issued, said the NTSB. The APA said in a statement that NTSB interviews have historically been done with a stenographer or with the investigators taking their own notes, and it believes the recording requirement is counterproductive. Quote, we firmly believe the introduction of electronic recording devices into witness interviews is more likely to hinder the investigation process than it is to improve it, the union said. Not only may the recording of the interviews lead to less candid responses from those witnesses who may choose to proceed under such requirements, but the existence and potential availability of interview recordings upon conclusion of an investigation will tend to lead many otherwise willing crew members to elect not to participate in interviews at all. And you can hear an extended discussion of both these airline stories on episode 737 of the Airplane Geeks podcast that I co-host. On that episode, we had John Ostrower, editor-in-chief of the Air Current, which broke the story on the United incident in Maui. In that podcast episode, John said that he's heard 3 separate versions of what led to the United incident, but that none of them could be confirmed. From AOPA.org, FAA extends expiration date of aircraft registration certificates. The FAA has extended the duration of aircraft registration certificates from 3 years to 7 years, a move that went into effect January 23rd. Temporary registration validity was also extended from the previous limit of 90 days to as long as 1 year for new applications. The extension from 3 to 7 years will have a positive effect on reducing the FAA's backlog of registration renewals of 6 months and sometimes longer. For aircraft purchases, the FAA will also no longer issue letters of extension and instead says that the aircraft registration application or pink copy will remain valid until the applicant receives an aircraft registration certificate or a denial notification, or after a registration has been pending for 12 months. The elimination of the 90-day temporary validity requirement is welcome news to help ensure pilots and owners can remain flying while waiting to receive their new registration. You will no longer need to request an extension. For registration renewals, if your registration is expired, you must apply and a new registration certificate will be issued, valid for 7 years. If your registration is current, you will be receiving a new registration certificate. From GeneralAviationNews.com, FAA expands airport hotspots alerts. In May 2022, the FAA began a test period to evaluate using AANs, that's Arrival Alert Notice, to provide a visual graphic of wrong surface landing hotspots. Since 2017, more than 80% of the wrong surface incidents documented by the FAA involved GA aircraft. The FAA industry and safety experts recommended 3 standardized shapes for surface-based and wrong surface hotspots. Cylinders represent wrong surface hotspots, that would be on the landing surface, and cylinders, by the way, would have some straight lines on the side of them, versus circles or ellipses, which would be completely round, represent surface-based hotspots depending upon the size of the hotspot. The symbols are published in the chart supplement. A cylinder is charted on airport diagrams at the runway ends associated with the hotspot and labeled with HS, followed by a number correlating with the chart supplement hotspot tabulation section. With the addition of the North Las Vegas Airport to the test program in December 2022, there are now 12 airports that are being involved in the test and the evaluation. One of those, by the way, we'll be talking about in a moment, which is the Reed-Hillview Airport in California. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot makes an expensive mistake. This comes from an ASRS NASA report written by a CFI. He wrote, I was giving a refresher flight to the pilot who wanted to practice some touch and goes from the right seat in the Cessna 172. The pilot has his commercial single-engine and multi-engine land certificate, CFI certificate, and about 250 hours of flight time on the same make and model of the plane. After we completed the flight and performed all of the shutdown checklist, we decided to push the plane to the parking spot, which is located close to our hangar. It's worth noting that the parking spot is on a small uphill. I took the tow bar and asked the student to push the plane by the wing strut. It turned out the tow bar was broken. It was loose, so I couldn't attach it to the nose gear. I decided to go to the rear of the plane and steer it by pushing the tail down and moving it to the left and right. Once we moved the plane to the spot, I looked around to find a chock to put by the tire so the plane wouldn't roll, but there were no chocks available. I still held the tail to prevent the plane from rolling and asked the student to pull the parking brake so he could install the tie-downs. After a few seconds, I heard a huge bang, and the shock wave threw me away from the plane. It turned out the student activated the BRS parachute system in the plane. It's also worth noting that the handle for the BSR system is guarded and in a red color. After I interviewed the student why he pulled the handle, he responded that he didn't know what it was, so he assumed that it had to be the parking brake. Again, the student had flown this make and model multiple times before. And of course, there aren't a lot of 172s that have parachutes, but that is a retrofit option available for those aircraft. From flyingmag.com, Joby Aviation begins final assembly of company conforming eVTOL and expects to begin flight testing this year. Joby Aviation said it began final assembly of the first company conforming version of its electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft. The company described assembly of the initial aircraft as a heavy lift and said the production process represents an important step toward the FAA certification required for commercial passenger operations. Joby said it has built the aircraft's main structure, including the fuselage, wing, and tail, and has begun assembling those components and installing electronics, controls, and propulsion systems. The Marina, California shop is set up for low-volume production, so Joby is considering proposals from a number of U.S. states for the location of a new production plant. The company said it expects to begin flight testing during the first half of 2023. And they are doing a lot of flight testing of the existing prototype. A few weeks ago, I was soloing a student pilot at the Marina airport, and I watched the Joby prototype do a test flight, and I took a close-up photo of it. And listeners who support the show via Patreon have access to that photo, which I posted last week. From SanJoseSpotlight.com, FAA pauses investigation of Santa Clara County leaded fuel ban. The FAA is temporarily suspending its investigation into Santa Clara County's ban on the sale of leaded fuel at its airports. The investigation is on hold for 6 months as part of an agreement signed between the FAA and county officials. The agreement also serves as an invitation for the two county airports, Reed Hillview and San Martin, to participate in a nationwide study to find best practices in implementing unleaded aviation fuel. The Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors, at the urging of Supervisor Cindy Chavez, voted in 2021 to prohibit the sale or use of leaded fuel at Reed Hillview, becoming the first in the nation to do so. The study is part of the agency's effort to achieve a lead-free aviation system by 2023. The agency approved the use of unleaded fuel created by GAMI for all airplanes last year, and other companies are exploring similar options. The study, set to be conducted by an industry-driven research program, will start later this year. Quote, the agency anticipates the county airports will join a demonstration project to collect data and develop best practices as the country's 200,000 piston aircraft transition to unleaded fuel, a spokesperson said. A limited number of other GA airports will participate in the demonstration project, selling a range of leaded and unleaded fuels. The new agreement with Santa Clara County comes more than a year after the FAA started looking into the county's decision to ban leaded aviation fuel. Walt Geiger, owner of a flight school at the Reed Hillview Airport, said he hopes the FAA study will help avoid what happened in Santa Clara County, where pilots can no longer access leaded fuel at the airport. Quote, we could have kept leaded fuel available and at the same time introduced unleaded fuel. That is what we petitioned the FAA to look into, Geiger said. I think the FAA is realizing that Santa Clara County created a firestorm, and they want to make sure that everyone understands what the safe transition to unleaded fuels look like. From FlyingMag.com, new summer camp offers spectrum of aviation activities. High school and middle school kids in New England will have an opportunity to sign up for a new aviation summer program offered by the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire at the Manchester-Boston Regional Airport, that's KMHT. The National Flight Simulator is also based at the airport, located about an hour's drive north of Boston. The 4-week STEM program, Flights of Discovery, will run from July 10th through August 3rd. The camp is the brainchild of Education Director Deborah Loesch. Rather than reinvent the proverbial wheel, Loesch reached out to aviation organizations around the country that offer kids camps, such as those run by the EAA, to pick their brain. Quote, I was not afraid to reach out to NASA. I reached out to Embry-Riddle and even local places that hold summer camps, and I just asked, how do you do it? And I worked with them to learn. The museum is encouraging kids to commit to the full 4-week program because everything they learn leads up to the end, which culminates in one activity. They learn how to navigate, talk with a tower, learn about flight instruments, and use the simulator to learn basic flight principles. And in the end, they fly their own course while talking to the tower, getting the weather from meteorologists who are also students. Loesch and the museum raised funds to subsidize kids from low-income families so that cost would not be a barrier to participating in the camp. Loesch said she grew up poor and is committed to helping youth find opportunities and resources to follow their aviation dreams regardless of their backgrounds. Quote, "When I was a kid, I always wanted to go to aviation summer camp," she recalled, "because I've been obsessed with aviation since I was a kid. And the problem was I couldn't afford it. So I wanted to create my very own summer camp that all kids would have access to." And she told that story at the museum's annual gala, asked for donations, and they raised over $8,000. The 4-week day camp will run from Monday, July 10th through Thursday, August 3rd. For information and to register, visit aviationmuseumofnh.org. And finally, from generalaviationnews.com, being a pilot is revealed as a world's dream job. A new study of Google searches finds that becoming a pilot is the world's #1 dream job, topping the list of 25 countries, including the U.S., the U.K., and Australia. Remitly, a financial services provider for immigrants, wanted to find out each country's desired profession to discover which jobs people would be willing to relocate for. To do this, they analyzed Google searches between October 2021 and October 2022 in all languages for search terms associated with dreaming of a new job or career, such as how to become a pilot, for close to 200 different job types, and ranked which are searched the most. And here's the rank, starting with number 1 down to number 10. Those dream jobs are pilot, writer, dancer, YouTuber, entrepreneur, actor, influencer, programmer, singer, and teacher. Quote, "Becoming a pilot, known for its excellent pay, great job prospects, and travel opportunities, is a clear favorite for everywhere from the UK and Australia to Cyprus and Montenegro," company officials said. With almost 1 million Google searches per year around becoming a pilot, it's the ultimate dream job. However, a career as a writer isn't far behind, topping the wish lists of countries including India, New Zealand, and South Africa. People are getting used to the idea of changing careers at least once in their lifetime as the flexibility to work online and retrain increases, said Jago McKenzie, business management director at Remitly. Some of the main reasons people seek a career move are for better work-life balance, higher pay, and a more meaningful and fulfilling career. With that in mind, I wasn't surprised to see so many people around the world showing clear search intent for a change. And to view the map, full data from the study, and for further sector-by-sector breakdowns, go to remitly.com. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, including we'll hear from Mike Bush about the new Continental SB, and later we'll talk with John Ewing about the amazing Diamond DA42 twin-engine aircraft. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to my client, Renato Steinberg. He just passed his commercial certificate in a multi-engine aircraft. He's a partner in a new DA42 that will deliver sometime in the next couple of months. So congratulations, Renato. And congratulations to Patreon supporter Chris Hoover. He says, I want to quickly share some good news. I just passed my Cessna 525 PIC type rating in a Citation M2. I'm really excited as this is my first jet. I have to say the G3000 is an amazing system. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It is awesome. So have fun flying that Citation M2, Chris. And congratulations to Jason Blair, who we often have here on the show. He was just presented with the Michigan Fast Team Member of the Year Award. Way to go, Jason. Well deserved. And congratulations to Vas Rajan. He says, Hi, Max. I just passed my instrument check ride at CDW. That would be the Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey, where coincidentally I did one of my early IFR training flights. He says, one of your recent episodes actually talked about the ILS critical area and the hold short line and ceilings for when it's mandatory. Guess what was on the oral portion of my test? Anyway, your show is a valuable part of the GA community and has also helped me burn a lot of calories at the gym. Boy, I wish it did that for me too, Voss. It's quite the opposite. He also says, one piece of advice to your listeners, don't wait to get your instrument rating. I waited for years. It simply makes you a better and safer pilot if properly done. Make it a priority and focus on it. You'll be glad that you did it. He says, anyway, thanks for everything. I went over to PayPal and made a contribution. Well, thanks so much for that, Voss, and congratulations. And here's a listener question from Mark Katz. He writes, Max, I'm looking for your perspective on the recent issue with Continental engines and the snap washer on the crankshaft. As you know, Cirrus grounded their fleet of SR22 and SR22Ts with engine build dates from June 1, 2021 through February 7, 2023, due to concerns about a snap ring counterweight on the crankshaft. The grounding has now been lifted if the engine has 200 or more flight hours. My Cirrus falls within this build range and has 280 flight hours. It is not clear to me why it is now okay if the hours are more than 200. He says in parentheses, an infant mortality issue, ? Also, apparently to correct the issue requires removal of 2 cylinders. I think Cirrus has been open, transparent, and handled this well. Not as positive about Continental, who seems to be less forthcoming, and the service bulletin has not yet been issued. Actually, it has been since he wrote to me. My question is, with an engine that has more than 200 hours, should I still consider having it inspected? He says, I do have faith in Cirrus and their recommendations, just wish I understood the seemingly arbitrary hour cutoff. Downside is that there are also risks with a significant engine teardown and repair. Would appreciate your perspective and thoughts. Thanks, Mark. Well, Mark, you know I always try to get authoritative answers, and my opinion would not help at all. So we ask an expert. Mike Bush recorded this for us. Here's what he has to say.
Hey, Max, you asked me to comment on this Continental counterweight retention circlip issue. Continental has now issued its service bulletin, Mandatory Service Bulletin MSB 23-01, which came out late last night. It was on Monday, February 13th, that it was issued. The FAA has not yet issued an AD mandating compliance with the Mandatory Service Bulletin. So it's not required to comply with the service bulletin unless and until the FAA acts. I would anticipate that they probably will issue an AD, probably a direct-to-final rule AD without comment period. But most likely it will take the FAA a couple of weeks to do that, and we haven't heard from them so far. It's also true that Continental is holding its cards pretty close to its chest. So for about a little over a year and a half worth of production, there's a possibility that somebody on the assembly line was not fully seating the circlips, the little internal snap rings that retain the crankshaft counterweight in place. And of course, if one of those snap rings comes out, the pin holding the counterweight can vibrate out, and the result is a counterweight release. If it happens when the engine is running, could be quite serious. It could poke a hole in the side of the case and so on. It is not clear that any of these releases have happened in flight. Continental, in their service bulletin, is silent on exactly what evidence prompted the issuance of the service bulletin. If the FAA follows up with an AD, which I kind of expect, the FAA will have to be a little bit more forthcoming because in issuing an AD, they have to reveal at least a certain amount about what led them to conclude that an unsafe condition exists warranting issuance of the AD. So we may find out more about what led to this if and when an AD is issued. Right now, everybody's kind of keeping us in the dark about that. But let's put into perspective what we do know. First of all, Continental is saying that if the crankshaft has more than 200 hours time in service, then you don't need to worry about this. What that is saying is that this is an infant mortality issue, that if the circlip was not inserted correctly, it would come apart pretty quickly. And since Continental would always add a significant safety factor, the fact that they say 200 hours, you don't have to worry about it, tells me that their engineering people probably said if it doesn't come apart in 100 hours, it's never going to come apart. They probably stretched out to 200 hours just to add a safety factor. That's the way it would normally work. Okay, the other significant piece of information was that Continental said, not only don't you have to worry about it if the crankshaft has over 200 hours, but if the crankshaft has under 200 hours, you can fly for up to 5 hours to ferry the airplane wherever it needs to go to have this inspection done. 5 hours is a very long ferry flight, and if Continental was really worried about this, they would say, do the inspection before further flight. The fact that they allow 5 hours of ferry time tells me that they're not very worried about it, that they think the likelihood of something coming apart is extremely low. I mean, because think about it. If somebody went ahead and ferried the airplane for 4 hours to someplace and had a counterweight release, the lawsuit against Continental would be prompt and most likely successful. So it's pretty clear that Continental thinks the probability of one of these things coming apart is very low, just from what they've said so far. Nevertheless, in an abundance of caution, they have decided that they want to make absolutely sure. And the accomplishment instructions in the MSB 2301 are very straightforward, nothing particularly complicated, nothing particularly difficult for most of the engines affected, including all the engines in the Cirrus aircraft. It requires removing cylinders number 1 and number 3, both on the same side of the engine, so you only have to drop the exhaust on one side, which is particularly good news for people who fly turbocharged versions of these engines. And you take the cylinders off so that you can get access to these circlips, and you use a little go-no-go gauge that is locally fabricated with instructions given for fabricating the gauge in the MSB to measure the circlip and make sure that it's fully engaged. If it's fully engaged, put the engine back together and you're done. In the very, very unlikely event that a snap ring is found that is not fully engaged, then Continental wants to have the engine removed and torn down. And I'm not sure why they want to do that. That seems kind of like overkill, but I don't expect that to happen very much. The number of engines affected, they don't say in the service bulletin. The best guess is about 200 maybe that will have to be inspected. It is true that we have a big mechanic shortage and most of the good shops are booked up months in advance. So complying with this service bulletin may require a certain amount of downtime. Could be months of downtime in order to get into the shop, even though the actual procedure is pretty quick. Continental is covering all this under warranty, and their warranty allowance in the service bulletin is pretty realistic. They're offering to pay for 18 hours of labor to remove the 2 cylinders and another 15 minutes or something to check the circlips, which once you have the cylinders off, then is not going to take very long. So their warranty allowance is pretty reasonable. They're going to pay for all of this. The only thing they're not going to pay for is whatever the impact of downtime is while aircraft owners are waiting to get their airplanes into the shop. Again, you don't have to do this until and unless the FAA issues an AD. I kind of expect that they will, but while we're waiting, there's no need to ground the aircraft. And personally, based on everything that I know, I think the risk is very small that any of these things are going to come apart. And if I owned one of these airplanes, I would not hesitate to be flying it while I was waiting to see what the FAA was going to do. Whether I would actually have the inspection done on my airplane absent an AD compelling me to do that, that's a close question. I might just wait and see, and try to get some idea of whether anybody's actually finding any problems. Because, again, I think Continental, based on the fact that they were allowing 5 hours of ferry time, are not very concerned that they're going to find many of these circlips not fully engaged. They're just doing this in an abundance of caution, probably led by their legal department, whose interest is in minimizing the chance that Continental is going to get sued, which is kind of the way things work. So I don't think this is very serious. The person who posed the question to you has an engine with 280 hours on it. I would absolutely not even consider the possibility of doing the inspection on an engine that has 280 hours on it. It's pretty clear that he's way, way, way out of the woods with that much time. And my interpretation of what they're saying is, A, there's an extremely low probability of one of these things coming apart, and B, if it gets through 100 hours or so and hadn't come apart, it's never going to come apart. So I think hopefully that will put things in perspective from my standpoint. And again, Continental is covering the cost of all this under warranty. So the only adverse issue for aircraft owners is whatever downtime they impose upon themselves by grounding their airplane, waiting for this inspection to be done, and trying to find a shop that has the capacity to squeeze them in. So that's my 2 cents on the subject. I'm taking what Continental has said and reading some stuff into it based on my judgment. But I think this is a pretty small deal and nothing to get terribly concerned about, especially if you have an engine with more than 200 hours. Now, again, this is about a little more than a year and a half's worth of production. The average GA airplane flies about 100 hours a year. So of the engines manufactured during that a little over a year and a half, there aren't going to be a lot of them that are over 200 hours. The only ones that are likely to be over 200 hours are ones that are in flight schools or charter operations or something where they fly a lot. Most owner-flown airplanes that had engines or crankshafts manufactured after July of 2021 are not going to have 200 hours on them yet. So certainly the large proportion of the owner-flown fleet will need to go through this inspection if the FAA follows up on the service bulletin with an airworthiness directive to make compliance compulsory. Hope that helps.
Mike, thank you so very much for answering that question. If you're unfamiliar with Mike, he is the 2008 National Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year. He writes the monthly Savvy Maintenance column in AOPA Pilot Magazine, and you can find out more about him at savvyaviation.com. Here's an email from Brent Connolly. He says, Max, I think it's time for me to support your program financially. I've been listening to your podcast often on my walk around my neighborhood that was built in the traffic pattern of November 05, Hackettstown, New Jersey, which is close to where I used to live. He said, just heard your story about a partial power takeoff years ago here in New Jersey. Was that inexpensive 172 rental a red aircraft by any chance? I think it was flying around here until a few years ago. Still stored in one of the remaining hangars over there. I do recall being checked out in it almost 20 years ago myself. Cheers, Brent. And yes, it was red. It's November 1257 uniform. I went and looked it up in my logbook. I flew it a number of times back in the 1980s. And my thanks to Brent for his interest in supporting the show. Let me tell you some other people who have signed up here in the past week to help support the show. We have 2 new mega supporters. These people are the heavy lifters. They support us at the $50 a month level. And after 2 months, I send them a copy of one of my books. Those 2 people are Tyler Watley and Ron Peterson. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a future show. And also thanks to Todd Shizzle and Sierra Squared, both of whom signed up at the $8 a month level, and to Ryan Dluglash, who added his pledge up to $20 a month. And we also had a one-time PayPal donation of $250 from Vaz Rajan. Thanks so much for that donation, Vaz. And if you'd like to become a member and join the club and help support the show, head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, where you can sign up via Patreon to make a monthly donation. Or if you'd like to make a one-time contribution, as Vaz did, just head out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And in a moment, we'll have our conversation with John Ewing about the Diamond DA42 Twin Star. And I want to ask you to stick around to the very end of that interview, where I'll add some additional information about the DA42. Now let me tell you a little about John Ewing. John is a professional flight instructor and FAA-designated pilot examiner who lives and works in Northern California. Mr. Ewing has experience as a Part 135 freight pilot, has logged over 10,000 hours of flight time, and holds a Cessna Citation CE 510 type rating with single pilot authorization. And now here's our conversation with John Ewing. John, welcome to the show. Great to have you here today.
Thank you, Max. It's great to be here.
So give us a little bit of background. How did you come to fly DA42s? How long have you been flying them? What's your time in them?
I started it was probably around 2008, and a student that I had contacted me and he said, I've decided I want to buy a multi-engine aircraft. I said, really? He said, yeah, and I'll stop the instrument training for a while and work on my multi-engine rating. I said, what kind of aircraft are you thinking about? He said, a DA42. At that time, I had no time in the DA42. I'd laid eyes on it maybe twice. So I got my requisite minimum of 5 hours time and type, and then we flew to Ohio to do a pre-buy inspection on a DA42. Ended up flying back a few weeks later. The deal was finalized. We brought it home, and that's how I started my DA42 training.
And how many hours do you have in these aircraft now?
The DA42, probably north of 1,200 hours.
Got it. And I'm guessing you've flown the DA62 as well?
Yes. In fact, the gentleman I was just talking about who bought the DA42 about 2.5 years ago upgraded to a DA62, and I still fly with him and fly in that aircraft.
Now, John, I'm guessing all airplanes have trade-offs, but you really like this airplane, don't you?
I do. The DA42 and the DA62 is one of my favorites, or two of my favorites. And yeah, it's just a great airplane and very stable, has good in turbulence, handles ice and bad weather pretty darn well, and it's comfortable for passengers. My wife is she's a bit of a nervous flyer. She's ridden in the 42 and 62. She likes it.
Yeah, I certainly have enjoyed teaching in these aircraft as well. So for folks who are unfamiliar with the DA42, give kind of a high-level overview description of the aircraft.
It's a lightweight, multi-engine aircraft. The main differences between it and other training aircraft are its composite construction, and it uses diesel engines instead of gasoline engines. I always tell people if you want to have a turbojet-like experience in a piston engine aircraft, the DA42 or the DA62 are really the only way I know of to get that, where your interface with the engines and the controls are virtually identical to a turboprop or a turbojet engine.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the specifications. Talk about how fast it is, climb rates, useful load, things like that.
So there are several variations of the DA42 out there, and depending on which aircraft you have, you're going to get slightly different performance, but generally most of the DA42s true out around 145 knots. You can get higher speeds at higher altitudes, and most of them are burning somewhere between 12 to 13 gallons per hour, 11 to 13 gallons per hour, and 75% power, giving you about 145 to 150 knots true airspeed. In terms of climb rate, at sea level, in most conditions, you're going to see between 1,000 to 1,200 foot per minute climb rates, depending on how the aircraft's loaded and density altitude. The takeoff performance is pretty good, but needs to be a little bit longer than what you would normally have for a single engine aircraft. And that's true for all multi-engine aircraft, just for safety. So that covers the cruise, the climb performance. In terms of useful load, most of the DA42s, you can carry 2 to 3 adults and a little bit of baggage with the main tanks filled. If you want to fill the auxiliary tanks, you will get very long cruise times. Most people will be ready for a bathroom break long before you start to run low on fuel. When these aircraft are ferried from Wiener Neustadt in Austria to Diamond, Canada, there are no ferry tanks added, and there are none that are needed. So at lower power settings for cruise with all the tanks filled, you don't get as much useful load, but you get a tremendous range.
And what are some of the major options available for these aircraft?
So the ones that folks are usually aware of, first of all, is the TKS system for flight into known icing conditions. And that really gives the plane a lot of utility. Anybody who's flown in actual conditions that involve icing, it's not something you want to take lightly. But if you think you might have an icing encounter and it's going to be less than moderate and it's going to be a short duration, having the TKS means you can launch, and not having it means you're probably going to have to delay or go a different day. There is also onboard weather radar that's available. There's air conditioning, and then some other things that are just kind of nice features. In this plane, the pilot and co-pilot seats are not adjustable. Instead, the rudder pedals are adjustable, and there is an electric rudder pedal option. And then there's some visors and, sun visors and other things that are kind of gee whiz items. But I say the most useful is the TKS. And the newer DA42s are coming with the G1000 NXI, which is a nice upgrade. The later models all come with the Garmin GFC 700 autopilot. Earlier versions might have the KAP 140. Most people prefer the GFC 700's more capable autopilot.
And for people that don't have the option for electric rudder pedals, describe what people need to do to adjust those pedals.
You have to reach down, and there is a black T-handle that's attached to the pedals, kind of between your feet, attached to a cable. And you pull that out until it clicks, and that releases the rudder pedals. And then you either pull on the handle to move the pedals back, or while holding pressure on the T-handle, you push forward on the pedals. It sounds a little tricky. It's kind of one of those things like, tapping on your head while you rub your stomach, but you can get used to it. And the main mistake people make when using the manually adjusted rudder pedals is there's a natural tendency to pull up on the T-handle, and that actually causes the cable to rub against the fitting, and it can cause it to fray and ultimately to break. So if you have the electric rudder pedals, it kind of takes all of that out of the equation, and it's much more convenient.
Okay, I think we've come up to tip number 1, which is get the option with the electric rudder pedals. I find that reaching for that is, it requires just a little bit more flexibility than my body has. And certainly the first few times I did it, it was very confusing because, as you described, you pull that handle, you got to keep tension on the handle while then pushing forward with your feet. So it's kind of like a 3 points of contact that you need to make simultaneously. So, the first couple of times it may feel a little awkward. Talk about the doors of the aircraft. How do you get in and out of this thing?
Well, you bring up a good point, which kind of follows with the manual rudder pedals, which is it's kind of a younger person's plane. It's not exactly, you don't have to be a contortionist to get in, but you do have to have a certain bit of flexibility. So the main way you enter, or the only way you enter the pilot seats, the 2 front seats, is through the front canopy. That canopy is unlocked from the pilot side, and then it hinges from the front. Then there are some handholds that you grab hold of along the front of the canopy to lower yourself into the plane. The access to the rear seats and the rear baggage area is all through a rear cabin door on the left side only. The doors are pretty durable, but generally I encourage people, if you are pre-flying the aircraft or loading it and there's windy conditions or there might be jet blast or roto-wash from a helicopter, don't leave the doors open. You don't want to put any more strain on them than you need to. So if it's super windy, you think you might get some jet blast, just keep the doors closed and open them as you need. Otherwise, the doors are pretty easy and pretty clear on how you use them. There's a lever to open them. The rear cabin door does need to be unlocked before flight because if there needs to be an emergency exit through that door, you can't get it open if it's locked from the outside. And then also, if emergency crews get into you and that rear door is locked, that makes their job more difficult.
Yes, and with the door up, I've found at times that it's hard to actually push it back because of the wind. In a Diamond DA40 one time, we had a stiff breeze and we were trying to push the aircraft back with the door up and open, and 2 grown men could not budge the aircraft. We put the door down and we were able to move it.
Another thing to avoid is, especially with the rear cabin door, is avoid slamming it and avoid handling it roughly because the hinges that attach to the aircraft on the top part of the door, they are made of composite. And if you put enough force on them, there can be cracks and things that develop, and it's not an inexpensive repair. Generally, I found it to be pretty durable, but one of the things to be aware of is, just don't put any more force on them than you need to.
Sure. Yeah, we never want to force mechanical objects, that's for darn sure. Let's talk about operation of the engines. The controls really are incredibly simple compared to your typical light twin. Go ahead and talk about that in detail so people kind of get an appreciation for how this works.
Sure. This is kind of a good news, bad news thing. The good news is you have 2 power levers that interface with the engines and through engine control units. There are 2 engine control units per engine for redundancy. And it's a by-wire connection between the power levers, and we don't call them throttles, we call them power levers, between the power levers and the engine control units. So the operation of the engine is very similar to turbojet. What we have as a readout for engine power output is a percentage load on the G1000, and it goes from 0 to 100%. And you just move the power levers to the power setting you want, and the ECUs take care of everything else. That's the good news. The bad news is that sometimes the technology doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, and you need to have some understanding about how the ECUs do their job and what are some of the potential failure modes. But in terms of operation, like I said, it's as close as you can get to a turbojet aircraft in a piston aircraft that I know of. And there was at least one training operation that used the DA42 to prepare pilots for their eventual training in citations, because the G1000 is very similar to what you have in the citation, and the pilot interface with the engines is very, very similar.
So for folks who haven't flown a typical light twin, talk about all the engine controls one would have in that aircraft as opposed to this single thrust lever operation.
So if you've got a conventional gasoline engine, you're going to have 3 controls per engine. You're going to have a mixture control, propeller RPM control, and then a throttle. And there's a fair amount of workload involved in how these things get adjusted. The ECU takes all of that out of the equation for pilots in the DA42 or the 62. You just set the power lever. The ECU, based on environmental sensors that it has, density, altitude, temperature, what have you, will set turbocharger boost, fuel flow, everything that it needs to set for the percentage power that you're commanding. And that makes your life very easy. I remember when I'd been teaching in the DA42 for quite a while, I had one pilot who wanted to do an instrument flight in a single-engine piston aircraft, high-performance aircraft. And I remember we were flying out over Concord, and he was wearing his hood and doing his checklist, and he went to do the leaning procedure, and this particular aircraft has a very complicated leaning procedure, lean of peak and what have you. And so he's going head down and doing all this. And I remember, because I'd had training in this particular aircraft, and I thought, that looks like a lot of work. That looks like a good job for a computer. So the DA42 is really quite simple to fly as long as everything's working the way it's supposed to, which is 99% of the time.
Yeah, talk about starting these engines. We've all had trouble starting GA engines. I want people to truly appreciate how good this is.
It's as close to an automotive style experience as you can get. You go through your checklist, of course. The cabin door needs to be secured. The rear door needs to be secured before engine start. You turn an engine master switch on, which provides power to the ECUs, and you'll see, probably you're going to see a CAS message coming up saying that the glow plugs are active for that engine. You wait until that goes out, and that takes about 5-10 seconds. And on the DA42, you turn the key in the direction of the engine you want to start, and it starts. You don't have to do anything with the power lever. Just make sure it's at idle, and the engine starts. The DA62 is similar, except there's a push button and there's no key.
Yeah, and the beauty of this is that it starts every single time. I don't think I've ever seen it miss. And certainly with the normal GA aircraft, wow, we have lots of failed starts.
The only time I've seen a difficulty was in a DA42 in very, very cold weather. And the engine was very difficult to start. And we were actually taking the plane to the factory in London, Ontario, for some upgrades that only the factory could do. And they ended up immediately going in and troubleshooting. And they said, well, your glow plug relay on that engine had failed, so you didn't have any glow plugs. But most of the time, the engine just starts. And a huge advantage for pilots is that your passengers feel much more relaxed. When you're a passenger in a regular GA aircraft that has a gasoline engine, and the passenger watches all the gyrations the pilot has to do to get the engine to start, and maybe sometimes the engine's reluctant to start, and then it rumbles slowly, it creates a little bit of concern for passengers who might not be experienced in small single-engine or multi-engine aircraft. You don't have that problem in the DA42. It just starts, and so there's no concern, there's no anxiety on the part of the passenger.
Yes, and the engines are so smooth as well, so that really is a joy with these aircraft. Well, let's talk a little bit about operating the aircraft with simulating a failed engine, for example. Some aspects of that are certainly easier as well compared to a typical twin. How would you secure an engine in training purposes, and it differs in real life? Talk about that as well, too.
So failure of an engine, especially during training or during a practical test, you've got to be careful how you do it. That's true regardless of what kind of multi-engine aircraft you're flying. So typically you're going to be at or above 3,000 feet AGL. So at or above 3,000 feet AGL. And near an airport where a safe landing can be conducted if, once you shut the engine down, it doesn't want to restart. How you simulate the failure in the DA42 is pretty simple. You're going to just bring the power lever back to idle. We don't want to simulate the failure of an engine using a fuel selector because that can damage the high-pressure fuel pump. So these are diesel engines. They run on Jet A, and they generate combustion from compression, so high cylinder compression, and precise fuel timing. And the way the fuel timing happens is with a incredibly high pressure common rail system. And there has to be a high pressure fuel pump to generate. So we're talking in excess of 20,000 PSI. If you turn a fuel selector off in flight, that pump, high pressure fuel pump, can cavitate and be damaged. And it's an expensive repair. So was one of the things we always emphasize during training is we do not kill an engine by turning the fuel selector off. So power lever only, bring it back to idle. And now, of course, it's the same mantra that every multi-engine pilot goes through. First, you're going to control the aircraft, stop the yaw, bring power up on the operating engine, identify which engines failed, dead foot, dead engine, verify, bring the power lever back. It's training we've simulated, it's already back. And then you're going to reach over and touch the engine master for that failed engine and say to yourself, am I going to fix it? Am I going to try to troubleshoot it, or am I just going to feather it? So typically we don't try to troubleshoot an engine if there isn't sufficient time, if we've already begun an instrument approach, if we're in the traffic pattern, or generally if we're below 3,000 feet AGL. Unless you're over open water or something and you really don't have any other options that you really want to troubleshoot. But as with all engine failures, whether in a single or a multi-engine aircraft, you never want to sacrifice aircraft control to run a checklist. So if you decide you want to troubleshoot, then you're going to go through your checklist and verify all the things that you can. And then if it's time to shut the engine down, which you need to do on a practical test, you need to demonstrate securing and restarting, you're just going to get verified that you've got the right engine master and you're going to turn it off. And when you do that, the engine stops and the prop feathers. And it becomes a little more quiet. And the plane becomes a little more easy to handle because the prop is feathered. There's less aerodynamic, adverse aerodynamic effects. You maneuver for a little while and then you're going to restart the engine.
Yeah, and tell us about different options for restarting engines and consequences of one versus the other.
This is another negative transfer if you've learned to fly in a gasoline-powered multi-engine aircraft. When you get in the DA42, the engine restart is different. So you're going to, first of all, have to have really good airspeed control. You want to get the plane relatively slow so that when you turn the engine master on and the prop comes out of feather, that it doesn't windmill continuously. Now, there are two different basic engine styles in the DA42. The Technify engines are the old, what used to be called the Centurion. That company was acquired by Continental, and it's now called Technify. So they're the Technify engines, and they're the Austro engines. And the Austro engines are the ones that were developed by Diamond. There is an AD for Austro engines that says that a windmilling restart is for emergencies only. And if a windmill restart occurs, the timing chain on the engine needs to be inspected. So we try to avoid a continuously windmilling condition in the Austro engines. Now, in a Seminole or a Seneca, this is totally different because you're probably going to go to a higher airspeed. You might have to enter a descent to get a high enough airspeed. And then you're going to unfeather the prop and you're going to allow the windmilling of the propeller to start the engine. It's totally different in the DA42 and the DA62. You want to avoid the continuously windmilling condition. So once you've brought the engine master on and the prop has come out of feather, it might occasionally turn one blade windmilling maybe every 2 or 3 seconds. When the prop is stationary, you're going to hit the starter and the engine's going to start. Another advantage with the DA42 is that because they're liquid-cooled engines, the engines stay warm, and you don't have a lot of operating limitations once you've restarted the engine about, I have to wait until the oil temperature gets above a certain level before I can go above a certain power setting. You can pretty much just bring the engine back up to 65% power, bring the operating engine back, and retrim the plane, and you're done. There is a limit on engine restart for the Austro engines that it needs to be restarted in flight within 2 minutes. So that doesn't give you a lot of time. A lot of people ask, why is that? And I don't know. But clearly, Diamond said during their training or their testing that if the engine was left shut down for more than 2 minutes, it became very difficult or impossible to start. So we want to avoid that. So that's a limitation that you want to be aware of and adhere to. But the engine restart is actually very, very simple. And I think most pilots who've flown other multi-engine aircraft, when they come to the Diamond, they don't really want to go back.
Yeah, there's no question. Engine operation is just a dream compared to traditional light twins. So for this restart to stop the prop, roughly how high do you need to pitch up? How slow do you generally need to get?
So a common error is that folks will have, during the simulated failure, they'll bring significant power up on the operating engine. And this is a common problem, regardless of the phase of flight, for one engine inoperative situations. Pilots are reluctant to reduce power on the operating engine. But there's sometimes you have to do that. So for the DA42, you want to be 90 knots or a little bit slower. So somewhere between blue line, VYSE, which depending on the version of DA42 you're flying, it's somewhere between 85 and 88 knots and 90 knots. So it means precise airspeed control. What you're probably going to need to do is reduce power on the operating engine. There's usually not a need to climb to reduce airspeed. You just need to reduce power and retrim the aircraft and be patient.
Now, if you were to, instead of shut down an engine, to simulate feathering the engine in training, how would you do that? What kind of percentages would you set for the failed engine?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are times in a practical test, for example, where you're going to have a simulated engine failure below 3,000 feet, where it would be dangerous to actually shut the engine down. So we're going to do, again, with the power lever, and once the pilot has identified, verified, and said, yeah, we're too low to try to troubleshoot, I'm just going to feather it. They touch the engine master switch of the engine they're going to want to feather to verify it's the correct one. And then on a practical test, it's the examiner's responsibility to set zero thrust. So in this plane, we're going to bring the power lever up to around 20 to 25% power, whatever gets rid of the gear horn. And that's the best way to simulate zero thrust. I will say about the gear horn, and this is true regardless of what kind of complex aircraft you're flying, whether it's a single or a twin, whether it's gasoline engines or diesel, be careful about intentionally configuring the aircraft in such a way that you hear the gear horn. Now, there's some times in the multi-engine aircraft where we have no choice. For example, during a VMC demonstration, you're going to hear the gear horn because that's what the VMC configuration requires. What I encourage instructors to do is, when the aircraft has been configured so that the gear horn is sounding, have the student or the pilot announce that they're hearing the gear horn and the reason why it's sounding. We never want to get into a habitual pattern where we're hearing the gear horn and we're ignoring it, because ultimately you will set yourself up to land gear up. So if you can't silence the gear horn, you need to acknowledge it and acknowledge the reason why it's occurring. So engine failure after takeoff, for example, is one of the tasks that has to be demonstrated. The power lever is just going to be brought back to idle. The pilot's going to go through their thing. identifying, verifying, and simulating feather, and then the examiner will set zero thrust, and you go in and do your landing.
And when people do the landing, do you expect them to close both throttles as they're landing, or should they leave the failed engine up at 20% so they get the true experience of what that would be like?
Don't let anything bad happen is my motto. No, the testing standards clearly indicate that they're supposed to land with a simulated engine failure. But in the interest of safety, sometimes you're going to have to bring power back on the engine that's been simulated feather because the aircraft will just float. You'll have directional control problems, and it doesn't really simulate what a feather propeller would how it actually behave in landing. Typically what I do is once someone has gotten down to about 50 feet over the runway, I'll either tell them they have both throttles, or I'll maintain control of the power lever for the failed engine, and as they enter the flare, I'll gradually bring it back. In an emergency, obviously, you're going to do what you need to do, but on a check ride, we don't want to have a simulated abnormality turn into a real emergency or accident.
And to your point about the blaring gear horn when the gear is up, I've recently adopted a new habit for myself because I worry. I've seen videos where the horn is blaring, people have become habituated to it, and they land gear up. Since I'm in the right seat, I now take my left hand and I put it underneath my leg near the trim wheel in a very uncomfortable, awkward position, such that the trim wheel actually is pretty annoying. Those little bumps are kind of grinding into my hand. And you can bet that is just so distracting. I leave it there until the gear are down because I want to remove that pain in my hand and that distraction.
I think that's a great technique. The technique that I use and that I encourage instructors to teach is that when somebody's going through their gear down before a landing checklist and their hand goes to the landing gear selector and they put it down, your hand stays on that until you see 3 green lights. Because if you don't get 3 green lights, you're not going to be doing anything else. So I always cringe when I see a pilot reach over, put the gear down, and then just their attention goes somewhere else. Their hand comes off the gear selector. So that's the technique that I do. And I also encourage people, you verify it when it first goes down. You verify it at the final approach fix or 400 feet AGL inbound. Or if you're in the pattern, turning base and turning final as part of your stabilized call out, gears down, 3 green. But yeah, we don't want to land gear up if we don't have to.
Now, can you manually extend the gear? Can you simulate that for training purposes? And if so, how do you do that?
It's pretty difficult because there's some controversy about do you use a circuit breaker to cause a gear pump to not be operational. Circuit breakers aren't switches. They're not supposed to be used as switches. So the thing is, in the DA42, if you pull the circuit breaker for the hydraulic pump for the landing gear, the pressure decreases pretty rapidly, and within a few seconds, the gear just falls into place. So if you're going to simulate a gear failure, you have to create a scenario and say the gear selector is down, even though it's not, but you haven't seen the 3 green. What do you do? And then have them, go through their procedure. But it's pretty difficult to do a simulation like you would in a Seneca or a Seminole in the DA42. The good news is the landing gear is very reliable. I've had very few issues in the thousands of hours that I've flown the 42s and the 62s. So
you've given lots of check rides in the DA42. What are some of the common errors that you see people making when they come to you for check rides?
It's pretty similar to what you see problems on any other multi-engine check ride. A lot of times the issue, like I mentioned before, in a simulated engine failure on an approach to landing or on an instrument approach, pilots are hesitant to remove power on the operating engine, even when they see that they're high and they're fast. And there is this urge for pilots on one engine to say, I need to carry extra speed or extra altitude. Nah, you really don't. You want to fly a single engine approach in the same sort of stabilized manner you would with 2 engines. The configuration might be slightly different. The power on the operating engine might be higher, but you still want a stabilized approach. So if you get high and you get fast and you're hesitant to remove power on the operating engine, ultimately then pilots will say, well, I'm really too fast now. And they make a big reduction on the operating engine. And this sets up the second problem, which is now we have a high rate of descent because we have a lot of drag. And we have the power of a Piper Archer remaining on that one engine to arrest that descent of a 3,300-pound aircraft. And this can set you up for a destabilized situation. So don't be hesitant to remove power on the operating engine if you see you're high and you're fast, and be prompt about restoring that power when you've gotten back on a stabilized approach. So that's the biggest issue that I see. Again, I see procedural things, the hand on the gear selector tell you get the 3 green. I'm not going to fail somebody for that, but I'm definitely going to talk about it on the debrief that, you might want to think about what you're doing here. Another difference with the DA42 is even on both engines, not a one engine inoperative situation. When you make a big reduction in power, there's something different that happens with the Ostro and Technify engines that doesn't happen in gasoline-powered engines, which is the ECUs, when you get below about 25% power, begin to increase the prop RPM, and it creates a lot of drag. So when you go power back to idle, you're actually going to enter a pretty aggressive descent. This is not a difficult plane to get down if you need to. You don't have to worry about shock cooling engines. And when you bring the power both back to idle, 1,500 foot per minute descent rates are easy to achieve. And that can set you up for a problem if you're expecting the similar kind of behavior that you'd see in a Seminole or a Seneca. The other thing to remember is the power levers in the DA42 are different than throttles in a gasoline-powered engine, where it's common for, say, a Seneca, when you move the throttles up to the high range, big changes in the high end of the power settings have very little effect on manifold pressure. When you bring the throttles back to the low manifold pressure area, very small changes result in big changes in manifold pressure. So it's not proportional. DA42 is exactly the opposite. It's completely proportional. The same amount of power lever change that you make in high power setting is going to have the same percentage power change that you will do at the low power setting. So how does this affect pilots when they first get into the DA42? On takeoff, you're climbing out, you get to do your climb checklist, and you're going to reduce power to climb power setting. People will reduce way too much because they're used to that experience that I've got to move the throttle way back to get a power change at the high power setting. You don't have to do that hardly at all. And that takes a little getting used to. But then as far as the other things, it's the common errors that folks can make in a multi-engine aircraft. Airspeed control, the VMC demonstration, all those things, emergency descent. The DA42 is, at its heart, is still a light multi-engine aircraft. And so you can have all the problems in it that you could have in any other Seneca or Seminole or any other aircraft like that.
Let's talk about total electrical failure that might ultimately cause the engines to quit. Now, this is certainly not something that's really likely to happen, but talk about the sequence of events that would have to happen in order for pilots' engines to stop operating because of electrical issues.
The important thing to remember about these engines are they require electricity to function. So the ECUs require power in order to be able to keep the engines going. This is a negative transfer of learning if you're used to a piston aircraft where complete engine failure, the magnetos still keep the engine running. So, you've got power. In this plane, if you lose all electrical power, the ECUs will stop being able to control the engine. That means the engine's going to shut down and the props are going to feather if you're in the air. So Diamond's done a bunch of stuff to create redundancy. So you have 2 alternators, one on each engine. You have a main battery. And then they have a series of backup batteries that will keep the ECUs functioning, even if both alternators fail. So the nightmare scenario is you have a dual alternator failure, and now you're running off the main battery. Depending on the health of that battery, it's going to last 20 or 30 minutes. And after it's fully discharged, your G1000 is going to go dark. Your ECUs will continue to run because there are dedicated batteries that keep them going. But after about 30 minutes, those batteries are going to be depleted, and so you need to land. Those backup batteries have a replacement interval. I believe it's every 12 months they have to be replaced. So you want to make sure that your aircraft's being serviced properly. The main problem where people get into trouble with the electrical system is There's a gotcha, and that is that the overhead map light on the pilot side is connected to the hot battery bus. That means if you bump that switch while you're climbing out of the plane at the end of a flight during the day and you don't see it come on, it'll stay on, and the next person who comes to fly, if it's been long enough, is going to find the main battery is depleted. The sequence that you can get into here is somebody calls them, well, we'll get an external power start. And you can do that in this plane. And you get one engine started. Now you've got an alternator going. You get the other engine started. And now, oh, we're all good. No, you're not. The main battery in this plane is a reverted gas battery. And they do not take very kindly to being deeply discharged. The second thing to remember is that letting the engine alternators charge a battery is a pretty brute force event. It is not the same as having a battery charger with a conditioner recharge the battery. So if you're in that situation where you require an external power start to get the engines going because the pilot map light got knocked on, the only place I'm taxiing to once I get the engine started is to maintenance, so they can take the battery out and do a cap check on it and verify that, and charge it and verify that it's functioning. So the electricity stuff you want to be really careful with. If you're one of those pilots who likes to push the envelope, you see a failure and say, what could happen? We'll be fine. You might find yourself in an uncomfortable situation in flight. So be careful with the batteries. Follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Don't do anything stupid.
Yeah, and if you're one of those kinds of pilots, I'm sure we could recommend other CFIs that would be willing to fly with you. So let's talk a little bit more about safety. What are some of the most common issues that have led to accidents and incidents in DA42s?
I don't know of a lot of accidents, but there have been some gear up landings. And again, it's usually been attributed back to becoming habituated to hearing the gear horn and just, and unintentionally landing with the gear up. And honestly, I don't know of too many other accidents. I do know of I believe it was a DA42 sensing platform. This is a DA42 that's set up to have, cameras and all kinds of other stuff for aerial survey or surveillance. And it was in a war zone and it was shot down. Otherwise, I think this plane is pretty darn reliable. So as long as you don't do the dumb things with the electrical system, the plane's you've got two engines, you got a lot of redundancy. It's a pretty safe aircraft.
Let me mention just a couple of other things besides gear up landings. Misfueling. I have read of a number of incidents where people have put 100 low lead into these aircraft. Of course, they are Jet A powered engines. And so at our flying club, our pilots are, first of all, the fuel caps have to be locked at all times. And second, the pilot has to be present when the aircraft is fueled. And I always encourage them that when they see the truck, look at that black label on the truck that says Jet A, and then look at the wing of the airplane and look for the same label and match those two. And I will mention we did have a misfueling at Palo Alto about a year and a half ago, and it was a Baron, and they put jet fuel into that. So these kinds of issues do happen. So pilots really have to pay a lot of attention to fueling. The other thing would be rear doors ripping off. I found a list of more than 15 incidents worldwide where rear doors have become separated, and it's all because the doors were not latched. You mentioned they are not to be locked, which would be with the key, but there is a latch, and you need to push that red lever in either from the outside or push it in from the inside, and that puts a pin into a hole which secures the door. If you don't push that latch, that pin does not go into the hole, and in the flight, the air pressure will actually suck the door out just slightly, so it'll probably be open half inch or something like that. And then if you try to close it by pushing that lever in, the pin is misaligned with the hole, and it's actually going to push it further out, which is then going to release the safety catch, and boom, that door has just left the airplane. So I am really very cautious about making sure I double and triple check that rear door is closed before we take off every time.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because there are a total of 4 doors on this aircraft. There are 2 nose baggage doors, there's the canopy, and then there's the rear door. And there is one CAS message for all of those doors, and it says door open, and it's in red. So it's a warning. It's a serious one you need to deal with. But when that comes on, you don't necessarily know which door is open. So what I've learned, School of Hard Knocks, is when you're about to start the engines, verify all the doors are shut. And that includes the main canopy. Now, the canopy has 3 positions. It can be open, it can be closed, and there's a cooling gap. The cooling gap can be useful in warm weather when you're operating on the ground. The canopy is supposed to stay closed in flight unless there is an emergency procedure for opening it for smoke evacuation, but generally, you don't open it. So when you go to load stuff into the nose baggage area, there are little micro switches there are 2 latches, front and rear, on each door. If you jam stuff in there, you can actually bend those micro switches, and now you've got the doors closed and latched and locked. You get in and you get a door open caution or a warning, and you don't know where it's coming from. You verify the canopy's closed, the rear door's closed. You might have bent one of those micro switches in the nose baggage. What you don't want to do is ignore that and say, oh, well, I'm getting that door open because I've got cooling gap selected. So what I encourage people to do is before engines start, close all the doors and make sure that warning goes away. Then if you want to set cooling gap, go ahead and do that. You don't want to get out to the run-up area, then close the cabin door or the canopy and say, wow, I've still got a door open. Oh, it must be one of the baggage doors. And now I'm in the run-up area with both engines running. So it is something that Diamond changed in the DA42. There is a discrete message for the baggage doors, for the left and right main doors, and the rear door. But on the DA42, there's only one. If the door in the rear comes loose, you're absolutely right. If it's not latched, don't mess with it. Land and fix it on the ground. The way to avoid that is make sure it's closed and latched before you take off. But if you get a caution message in the air, you really want to land and investigate it on the ground. You don't want to try to troubleshoot it in the air because you could make things worse. What Diamond does say is if the rear cabin door does separate from the airframe, if it comes open and it blows off, the aircraft is still flyable. And I know pilots who've had this happen, and they said it was really noisy in the back seat, and the passengers were really nervous, but the plane flew pretty normally. So it is one of the shortcomings or dangers in the plane that you need to be aware of and manage that hazard.
Of course, if you do lose the door, the air conditioning gets much better in the aircraft immediately, right?
You want to have those noise reducing headsets for sure.
Definitely. I'm going to ask you about your books in just a moment, but before I get to that, are any other kind of final tips or thoughts on the DA42?
The biggest thing I'll say has to do with the Jet A fuel. You want to be really tidy around this plane. A Jet A is the gift that keeps giving. If you get it on your hands, if you get it on your clothes, if you spill it in the nose baggage area, if you spill it inside the plane, it does not go away. And it's very irritating and annoying. So what I encourage people to do is use disposable gloves, like nitrile gloves for the pre-flight. Do all the dirty stuff first. Check the engine oil, sump the fuel. Then take your fuel sump. Most people use a gas jar. Turn it upside down and lean it up against the nose wheel and let it drain while you do the rest of your pre-flight. So you get as much of that Jet A out of there as you can. Take those gloves off and throw them away so that you don't transfer Jet A or oil to the props or any other part of the plane, inside or outside, that you might touch. At the end of your pre-flight, when you pick up that gas jar, put it in a Ziploc bag, get all the air out and zip it closed, then put it in another Ziploc bag and close it. Be ready to regularly replace those Ziploc bags because, again, Jet A is the gift that keeps giving. Otherwise, all the comments you made about misfueling, exactly right on. Be there to supervise fueling. I'm hesitant to lock the fuel caps because sometimes the locks malfunction and then you can't get the fuel cap off and now you can't get fuel onto the plane, and that can create its own set of problems. But you do want to avoid misfueling, any type of wrong fuel, regardless of whether the plane is powered by Jet A or 100 low lead or whatever. You don't want the wrong fuel in there.
Great tips. Well, I know you have a book on the DA42 as well as some other books. Tell us about those and where do people find them?
Yeah, so I have several books that I've written. I started with the Concise Guide to IFR, and that was an iBook. That was my first foray into publishing. That's since been updated to the new Concise Guide to IFR because it's substantially rewritten. I then created one for the DA42, and that's been pretty popular. It covers all the variants of the DA42. It's due for an update, which should be in the next few months. I also have one for the DA40 180, which is the gasoline-powered, Lycoming-powered version of the DA40, and also one for the DA40 NG, which is pretty much the same plane except powered by one Ostro engine. And then I have one on the Cessna 172S. I had written one in the past for the Citation Mustang. A lot of people still send me questions about that. That book, I transferred all the ownership and digital assets to my former employer, so they haven't chosen to publish that book again. So a lot of times I get questions: is that Citation Mustang book still around? It's not. So you have to use your materials from flight safety or wherever else you're doing your training. So that's the main books. There's also one on the DA62. I'm currently working on a print version of hard copy, paperback version of the DA62 book. And I have plans, depending on how that works out, to make that available, the other books available in a paperback version too. But that's a work in progress. So having a publishing empire, such as it is, tens of dollars are made every month. It is time consuming, and I do have other things that I have to do. So it's on a workload permitting basis. So.
And what's your website? Where do people find out about you and your books?
The best place to go is the Apple Bookstore, and you can search for the Concise Guide and my name. Some of the books are also available on Google Play. When the hard copy versions are available, I'm not sure how that's going to be distributed, but if you ever have any questions, the Apple Book Store is probably the best place to go first.
John, thanks so much for joining us today on the show. It's been great having you here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And my thanks to John Ewing for talking with us. Now, I've owned a copy of his The Concise Guide to the Diamond DA42 ebook for some time, and if you plan to fly a DA42, I would encourage you to get a copy. I got mine through the Books app that can be found on an iPhone or iPad. Now, here are a few other things I want to share with you about the Diamond DA42. John and I didn't talk a lot about the version that uses Lycoming engines. That's the 180 horsepower Lycoming IO360 engines. That version was dubbed the DA42-L360, and it was certified for the North American market in August of 2009. And unlike all other versions of the DA42, that aircraft runs on 100 low lead, which makes it even more challenging for pilots and fuelers to make sure that they get the correct kind of fuel, because some DA42s take 100 low lead, even though most of them are fueled with jet fuel. Also want to talk about the restart time. John mentioned that when the engines are off, you have up to 2 minutes to restart them. That's true for the earlier versions, but there's been a change which now allows much longer restart times for aircraft that have been updated with what's called MAM 42-938. And MAM stands for Mandatory Änderungsmitteilung, which is essentially a mandatory design change. And that's something that becomes standard from a certain time of production at the factory. So anything built after a certain time has this particular change. I believe it can also be retrofitted to many older aircraft. And what it now says is that for altitudes up to 15,000 feet, you have to restart immediately. Below 10,000 feet, you can restart for up to 10 minutes, provided that the temperature is above -5°C, which would be 23 degrees Fahrenheit, or you have 5 minutes to restart if the temperature is between -15 and -5°C, which would be 5 to 23 degrees Fahrenheit, or if the temperature is below -15 degrees C, which would be below 5 degrees Fahrenheit, then you have a maximum of 2 minutes of engine off time before you must restart the engine. And I also want to mention another resource from longtime patron supporter Trevor Moody, who I've had a lot of email conversations with over the years. He has a spreadsheet that he's put together of Diamond DA42 accidents. And this lists about 50 different incidents and accidents. Most of them are in the U.S., many of them, though, are overseas. And he mentions in the comments field a brief summary of what the issue was. So, for example, there are a number of these which were gear up landing. A number of these are the rear passenger door that's separated in flight. If you're interested in seeing this full list, Trevor has kindly said that he would be happy to send it to you. All you need to do is email him at trevor.john.moody, M-O-O-D-Y, @gmail.com. And I also want to mention a couple of resources that are online, groups that can help you if you're a Diamond owner or interested in learning more about Diamond aircraft. If you go out to diamondaviators.net, that's the DAN, which it's been called over the years. The Diamond group has been around for a long time. It's got an online forum. I actually spoke to that group in 2008 when they were meeting at the AOPA summit meeting that was held in San Jose that particular year. Great group of people. Now, there's an article that just came out earlier this week from AOPA that says that there's a new Diamond owners type club that is forming. I'll include a link to this in the show notes, but it says that Ed McDonald, club president, said that they are hoping to expand on the work of the DAN community and form an owners group. They expect to have their website up and running sometime in March. And it says that any Diamond's owners who have questions about this new Diamond Pilots Association or are interested in more information can email contact@diamond-pilots.org. And finally, my thanks to everyone who contributes to the show. If you haven't done something to help the show out, here's what you can do. Just go out and tell one friend of yours today about Aviation News Talk. And if they're unfamiliar with podcasts, show them how to get it on their phone, on the website, however they can get a podcast. Thanks so much for sharing the word about Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down. You can always